The Quebec government recently tabled Bill 96 to try to promote the use of French in the province. Economists, though, suggest there are better ways to promote a language rather than using laws and restrictive measures. It's all about economic return. Vincent Geloso is with the Montreal Economic Institute. Thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So if I understand this correctly, then the incentive to learn a language is greater if the returns for learning that language is greater, correct?
Exactly. That's an accurate summary of what we're trying to say. And what we mean by that is that language is just like education. When you learn a new language, you're essentially acquiring what economists call human capital. When you acquire human capital, your returns, that means your income, will go up. Now, the thing is that the value of a language depends on who else speaks that language. So if you make everyone who speaks French more productive worker, more educated workers, more entrepreneurs, more prosperous as a community, the attractiveness of French goes up. So the argument essentially boils down to this. If you make the French group more economically attractive, immigrants who come to Quebec will choose to learn French before English. Simultaneously, Anglophones will choose to conduct the greater portions of their lives in French.
Now, you show this by example by looking in history, right? What happened before 1940 and what happened after 1940.
Yes. So the best place to look at is, as I'm an economist who does a lot of economic history, that's actually my field of expertise, is that when you look at the past, you can find that before any linguistic laws are adopted in Quebec, the proportion of people who try to speak French stagnates. People who are not French who try to speak French stagnate until the wage gap between Anglophone and Francophones start to close. So when, until 1940, the gap between Francophones and Anglophones for incomes stays flat. It's always the same gap. But then in 1940, something happened and Francophones catch up with Anglophones. And it's from that point on that Anglophones start trying to learn French. So we see rising rates of bilingualism in the 30 years up to the 1970s. Before any linguistic law is adopted, you see rising rates of bilingualism amongst Anglophones and also amongst allophones, so people who are immigrants who have neither French or English as their first language. They learn French more and more, largely because the shrinking wage gap between Francophones and Anglophones speaks to the greater and increasing value that French had in economic life, so that the returns from speaking French grew greater. And in fact, the story is that in a case like this, greater returns from French, more vitality for the French language.
And you credit a lot of this to educational reforms, not language laws.
Exactly. So the seeds of that convergence that I discussed that started in the 1940s is largely due to things that have nothing to do with linguistic laws. As I said, the timing of what I mentioned is before any linguistic law is adopted. So the only other candidate that's left is the educational reforms that Quebec did in the 1940s that allowed Francophones to stay in school longer, to complete their high school diplomas, acquire college diplomas, and become highly skilled workers relative to Anglophones so that the wage gap collapsed. That story is the one that you care about. And today there's still room to replicate what was done in the 1940s by, for example, increasing the rate of high school completion amongst Francophone, which is still 10 percentage points lower than it is for Anglophones.
Now, all this makes perfect sense, but, what you're talking about are not direct measures, but they're more long-term measures, like raising the educational levels. That, though, is going to be a very hard sell politically, right? Because it makes sense rationally, but it doesn't make sense politically.
Well, I'm an economist. I try to make sense in the sense of economics. Political sense, I leave that to other people who have more patience for political gains. But it is worth pointing out to anyone who has this political mindset that the returns from not being flashy, not doing flashy things that are unlikely to yield very substantial results, because linguistic laws have probably gone as far as they can in terms of yielding improvements in French vitality. Doing measures that are more indirect, although less flashy politically, are more likely in the long run to generate the intent that is being meant. So if we have any politician out there who is really, truly well-minded, I would really urge them to put the attention on where the bangs for the bucks will be, which is these indirect ways, such as increasing education amongst Francophone or entrepreneurship amongst Francophone to make the Francophone economic community have a greater level of vitality.
Okay. Well, it's very good advice. I hope people follow it. You optimistic?
I hope so too.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for this. It was very interesting. And for more information on the article that Vincent Geloso has put together, it's available at the Montreal Economic Institute, IEDM.org. Thank you so much.